One, two, three.
Welcome to Scalta. My name is Joe Austin, and can I remind you, if you've just joined us this evening, that Scalta is a joint production of Falcha Fears to Hear and Feel and Full. And my guest today has both a very famous title and comes from a very famous county. So it's Owen Reidy. How are you doing?
How you doing, Joe?
He's the Assistant General Secretary of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. It's a very grand title, and I'm sure every bit of it's earned. Welcome back to the Connolly Centre. I know you've been here a number of times, and probably to talk to a trade unionist, there's no better location.
Yep.
It kind of struck me when I was putting the interview together that you don't look like a senior trade unionist, and that's a compliment rather than an insult. Both in terms of your age.
Not long enough for.
Well, both in terms of your age, but also the old-fashioned idea that a trade union leader, it's beer and sandwiches, that kind of a concept. It's long gone.
Yeah.
I hope, isn't it?
Those stereotypes they don't come out of the sky. They're there for a reason. Many of our opponents try and stereotype us, and obviously sometimes we drop the ball ourselves. So I think trade unionism is a very modern concept. We have a rich history, but we learn from our past and build for our future. And I think the trade union leaders, we've seen them right throughout this pandemic. They're the people working on the front line. They're the activists in a whole range of unions in public and private sector right across the island, right across these islands, and they're the real leaders. People like me are privileged to work in a role that we love, to try and help them be the best they can be so that they can get justice at work and fairness in society.
I mentioned that you have a very prestigious title, but there's a long journey from A to B there. So tell me, if you don't mind, tell me a bit about your background, and then where does trade unionism come into it?
Yeah, well, I had the misfortune to be born in Dublin, but I'm very much from Donegal. The Dublin people that I know in SIPTU, where I worked for 18 years, don't like to hear me say that, but born in Dublin, 1972, grew up in Donegal. Father worked in the bank, so we moved around quite a lot. Mother was a school teacher. Both were trade union members. Grandfather's from Derry, Stephen McGonigal. He was a trade unionist in the Garment Workers Union. He set up his own union in Northern Ireland as well, the Clothing Workers Union. He ran as an independent Labour candidate in 58 and 62 in the Foyle constituency. He nearly beat McAteer in 58, came close. Got votes across the community. He would have been a Labour man, but with a small n for nationalism. He was a big influence on me. We had a really close relationship. He'd come down to Moville where I lived, and we'd go fishing in Kildare, talk politics. He knew young Jim Larkin and people like that. They were his contemporaries. I had joined Democratic Left, post-Workers' Party. He was a Labour man, so we used to have a lot of ideological conversations about that. And he was a huge influence. And I then, after university, went to work in Spain for 2 years, taught English very badly, but great 2 years post-college. And my mother sent me an ad for an official in SIPTU, for jobs in SIPTU, and I applied out of the blue, went through the process, and ended up started working in Mayo in 1998. Spent 2.5 really happy years there, great people. Learned a hell of a lot from some of the really super union officials. The first union official I worked with, he just said to me, I want you to follow me, I want you to ask questions in the car, watch, observe. I don't want you to do any frontline work yourself for the first 3 months. And he's retired recently, Sean Nolan's his name, great guy, and I learned so much from him. And you learn every day. We're still learning. I worked in SIPTU for 18 years and ended up on the management team of SIPTU for the last 3. I had a lot of high profile disputes, the Lewis, Dublin Bus, things like that.
Of course, yeah.
And then applied for the job in the ICT about 5 years ago. Patricia King is the General Secretary, and I worked closely with her at SIPTU. And the fact that I suppose my mum's from Derry and I had that connection with Northern Ireland, because the post is looking after Northern Ireland, was a kind of an emotional pull as well. So in a way, it's kind of a coming of full circle.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, the reason I'm asking you that is that we would have a fairly heavy footfall of people passing through here. Lots of them are local people, but not them all. And when they start understanding the relevance of Connolly today, as opposed to what Connolly was, or indeed how Connolly died, which is a very small part of his life, in my opinion. But you find that you kind of scrape them, and just like your own grandfather and my own father and my grandfather, you find there's a long history of trade unionism that's steeped in hardship and fighting for conditions and all of that. And then we asked the last question, what union do you belong to? And they go, don't need to be in a union now, you know. And that amuses me. And I want to talk a wee bit about the relevance of the union now and the strength of the union and the diversity of it. But I'm interested, you know, you talked about that learning experience and don't do anything for 3 months. And I've been through that. When in my case, it's been 3 years. Did you find that you kind of, as a young man, you came into a job that was dominated by both older men and by people who kind of cut their teeth, you know, in the 40s or 50s, perhaps the 60s?
I remember when I came in, because it was the class of '98, there was about 20 of us on it. And I remember a couple of people saying, well, where were you a shop steward? You know, where did you work? And I was like, well, I spent 2 years in Spain teaching English. And I wasn't a shop steward. It was, some people kind of looked a little bit suspiciously like, well, who do you know? Or, you know.
Yeah.
But SIP2 has a long tradition of taking people in from different backgrounds. And I used to say, you know, if you have it in the heart and you have it in the head, it doesn't matter what you did. I mean, if you believe in the philosophy and the politics of trade unionism, what you've done before isn't that relevant. So I think there was quite a few people like me, and once people overcame the skepticism, once you could show that you were serious and you could do the job. But that first 3 months, I mean, I could have had another branch secretary who could have said, there's the file, you've a meeting in a half an hour, and it could have sunk. Yeah. So you've got to invest in people, and you've got to support people, and bring them along. But I think, you know, and I've been involved in recruitment in SIP2, and you'd see people from political backgrounds, community backgrounds, trade union backgrounds. And I think if you just take people who have been shop stewards, it's very insular and you're just talking to yourself. You've got to take people who have, you know, a perspective on the left, wherever that is, but who are serious about industrial relations and who are passionate to their fingertips about economic and social justice for workers and believe in the strength of collective bargaining. And I think they're the ingredients. So I was very lucky with the people I worked with. If I've had any success, it's and any positives, it's because of the learnings from them. And I just feel so privileged to be in a job where every day you're learning. Every day it's different. Every day there are challenges that you know, inspire you and motivate you. And you know, I don't feel I'm working. I feel it's part of who I am and what I am. And I think I'm very lucky.
Part of the great adventure.
Yeah, part of your, if you're able to find a job that pays you to rear the family, that is part of who you are, part of what you believe, you're incredibly lucky, incredibly privileged, and I'll never forget that. I'll never take that for granted.
I remember someone telling me, many years ago, that a good trade unionist is an ambassador, and so that everything you do, and you mentioned the community sector and all of that, everything you do sells the value of the union, but also demonstrates the honesty of the union. And SIP2, which a long time ago, I think SIP2 actually overtook the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. They amalgamated. Yeah. But SIP2, I remember a discussion I had with a SIP2 official, and they were embarking on this amazing campaign about having women officials. And this isn't like 1930s. It isn't even the 1960s. It's the 1980s. Yeah. And it was like, this is what we have to do. This is a battle. And I think, in fairness to SIP2, that has continued to this day. Yeah.
I mean, I think traditionally, historically, union officials predominantly were male and the administrators were female. Thankfully, that's changing. I mean, if you look at, say, the general secretaries of the congresses on these islands, Patricia King, the leader of the trade union movement in Ireland, Francis O'Grady, who was here for the opening of the Comedy Centre, right. And then you've got Ros Foyer in Scotland and Siobhanna Taj in Wales. Four great women, four great leaders. But you know, it's important that it happens at all layers and all structures. SIP2 had a policy in recent years when they had their general secretary, vice president, president, that one of the three had to be of either sex, which I think is really important. In the class I started in 1998, about 50% were women, and many of them have gone on to leadership positions. So that is changing, and it's really important because women, if the trade union leadership doesn't reflect the society and the workforce it needs to represent, we're missing a trick. And that's the same when it comes to migrant workers, people from minority communities, right across the board. And youth, that's a big issue. You said, look, I'm 48, I'm middle-aged. If we're trying to organise young workers, who's going to do that? It has to be young people organising young people because there's a shared experience there. And I think it's about kind of one of the other attributes we need to have is to listen a lot more rather than to presume we know what people and what workers want. And I think that's a major thing too. But it's an ongoing thing, Joe. You never reach nirvana. It's a constant need to renew, constant need to make sure we're going the right way. But there are some very impressive female trade union leaders in Northern Ireland and right across the Republic too.
The comment about being middle-aged, don't let it depress you because I'm beyond middle-aged and I've all my own teeth and I'm still able to walk straight up. So don't be that. I'm just saying that because some smart aleck watching this will go, yeah, he could be Owen's daddy, So let's.
He's not, but he could be.
As far as I know, I'm not. I want to ask you, just in terms of, you mentioned that the need to push out and to encourage young people. Is there a particular, and of course new citizens, which I want to return to, is there a particular section of our community that is more difficult than others to be convinced that trade unionism is fundamentally important to their job?
I don't think it's that one particular sector more difficult. I think it's that maybe we as a movement haven't tapped into it in the way that we should. If you do, to be fair, and let's be frank, if you look at the profile of the trade union member across the island of Ireland, they're a male or female, it's 50-50 now, but they're probably people around my age. And if you go to trade union conferences, there are people my age and older, there's not enough young people. And I think this generation, if you think about it, they were scarred with the economic crash of 2008 and now the COVID crisis and all that goes with that. And they're maybe the first generation that are looking at their parents and are saying, can we expect the same security that they had? And in many cases, when you talk to a lot of them, they don't expect it because they don't see it. And I think we need to model the way where they have a right to demand an end to precariousness and some type of security in as much as you can achieve in an uncertain world, and a better balance of fairness because women and young people are disproportionately affected by these things. So I think the real challenge for the trade union movement is to tap into young people. I have a 19-year-old and a 14-year-old. Okay, they've grown up in a trade union house, so it's different. But my 19-year-old, when she comes out of third level, how many of her peers are automatically going to join a trade union, irrespective of what they do? And there's this view from some people who don't know us that trade unions are for blue-collar workers. Well, we're for all workers,
yeah, of course.
Right across the spectrum. If you look at the 800,000 workers that we organise across the island, they come from every part of the community, every social strata, every industry. But one of the reasons why we're not as strong as we are is that maybe we have to reform more and be more nimble. But the other reason is that the political legislative context in which we operate in, we were still living with the legacy of some of the Thatcherite legislation in Northern Ireland. In the Republic of Ireland, the trade union legislation is not as progressive as the rest of Europe when it comes to organising. We don't have the right to organise. So we've got to campaign, we've got to agitate, and we've got to mobilise politically to make sure that the conditions we work in are more fruitful to organise people. But we've also got to make sure our message resonates with them. And I think it's a twin-track approach.
That message, and you have particular responsibilities for the North, as you make a point. And it's foolish not to look at the sectarian division of workers and the historical division of workers. Does it bring a particularly different flavour to it? Does it mean that you approach it? You would be forgiven perhaps for wondering, does the trade union movement tread carefully? Or is it something in just a different dimension to it?
There's definitely a different dimension here. And there are many views on that. When we engage with some people from the unionist community and some unionist politicians, some of them will say the leadership of the trade union movement in Northern Ireland is very green. And I find that ironic because without mentioning names, in our leadership, in our Northern Ireland committee, we've people who describe themselves as Republican, nationalist, loyalist, unionist, none of the above, socialist, and obviously you can be socialist on all of the above as well. We have a very diverse membership. We are actually probably a microcosm of Northern Ireland society with all its pluses and minuses.
Idiosyncrasies.
And but there are challenges with that. I don't know for some people because it's the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. Maybe it is. I see some people on social media saying, trade unions are for Republicans and nationalists, and it's a tragedy that someone would say that. Trade unions are for everybody.
Of course.
And my job and the job of the people in our leadership is to prevent that binary, kind of divisiveness about the trade union movement. We work with all political parties that will work with us, but want to be beholden to none.
Which is a fair point. I understand that, and I think the complexities of dealing right across the political spectrum is exactly as you point out. That you embrace people who have got a similar view that people's lives should be enhanced rather than detracted from. Is there, we have a fairly large, and this immediate area as well, but we have a fairly large new citizen community from right across the world. Yeah. They tend to be low paid. They tend to be treated badly. And I know there are very fine examples. For instance, the Indian Workers Association in England and stuff like that are very militant trade unionists and all of that. But does that bring a particularly different attempt to bring in those new citizens into the union?
Yes, it does. But when I came up here to the job first, I was surprised that only 5% of the workforce were migrant workers that aren't Irish, Northern Irish, British, or both.
Yeah.
And I was wondering why that figure was so low. And the figure is lower because most of those migrant workers will go to the Republic of Ireland where the wages are higher, albeit the cost of living is higher. But we have a migrant workers outreach centre within the ICTU. Kevin Doherty, one of our officials, deals with it and heads it up. And we've been doing a lot of capacity building with Bulgarian workers, Romanian workers, particularly in the food sector. And it's been really important. But the key is it's about facilitating those workers develop their own voice. It's about not doing it to them. It's about allowing it to do it for themselves. And it's the same with all struggles. People don't achieve rights because they're handed to them. They struggle and they win them for themselves. That's the way it should be. Yeah. It's the best way. It's the most durable way. So our job is to try and tap into that community, build networks, build relationships, but let them agitate for themselves. And we've seen in our NHS, in the food sector, two frontline areas in the pandemic. Many of those workers went to work when people like me had the luxury of being able to work from home, no interruption with salary. Many of these guys were put on furlough and things like that. So it's really, really important that we make sure post-pandemic that those issues, their issues and wider issues, are not swept under the carpet. That was, like a puppy's good for Christmas. It's grand to treat workers well during a pandemic, but we'll go back to the way it was. So whether it's migrant workers, whether it's young workers, whether it's workers from a unionist background, nationalist background, all of these cleavages are there. And I think the same principles apply, but it's about tapping into their networks, and it's about opening ourselves up and not presuming we know what they want. I'll give you an example. I dealt with contract cleaning workers for the first time in 2007, 2010 in the Republic of Ireland. We had a big campaign in SIPTU, and I presumed contract cleaners, low paid workers, their biggest issue would be pay. And pay was a big issue. The biggest issue was respect.
Yeah.
And what they used to say was, we're contract workers, whether it's in a hospital or a factory or a school or whatever. Nobody knows our name. We're not part of the team. They don't look us in the eye. We want respect. And, there was me presuming it was all about getting an extra euro or €2. And that strikes you and that lasts with you. And respect isn't by getting an extra euro or two. It's by being treated fully as a key part of the team. And you think of it, a contract cleaner in a surgical ward, very crucial. You look at COVID-19,
of course,
an essential part of that overall team. So I think, I think we need to listen to people, and we need to reflect what their interests and needs are, and we need to adapt to that. And I think that's an ongoing process.
I want to return. I want to return to post-pandemic.
Yeah.
The battle that's going to happen.
Yeah.
By the way, I like your shirt. It's very similar to my own.
Two for the price of one, Joe. Maybe.
Good. You've good taste as well as good leadership. In terms of when you're not breaking bosses' hearts, because that's what your job is. Not good bosses, bad bosses' hearts. How do you relax? First of all, do you know what the word relax means? Do you get a chance, or are you glued to your phone? And if you're not, what do you do? How do you take time out?
Do a number of things. Highlight of weekends are watching the kids. Well, one's a young adult, 19. She plays Gaelic football for her local club. Son plays soccer and Gaelic football for the local club. Both were born in Dublin. Thankfully, he's a Donegal fan. So even though he's a Dub born and bred, sport with them is huge. I mean, when you look at the sport over the weekend, the highlight for me was standing on the side of a pitch at an under-14s Division 1 game in Dublin. Not, Barcelona, Argentina, England, Italy, even Donegal, Derry, all important games. So that's huge. I play guitar mediocrely, much to the children's frustration at times, but that's a great way of relaxing. Go up to see my father a lot in Donegal when I can, travel post-pandemic, those kind of things, read a bit. But work is, for me, very much part of life and who I am, and there isn't kind of like it ends here and that starts here, and I'm kind of very comfortable with it that way. I wouldn't want it any other way, actually. I love it, and I'm enthused by it, and it drives me. So,
when you're watching your children, your adult children involved their sport, do you hurl from the ditch? Are you quiet spectator?
I'm very quiet. I'm not going to embarrass them. I'm quiet, and I'd have great chats after about the tactics and the game and how it went and all that. No, I don't. There's enough parents on the sideline. I mean, parents need to keep quiet and let the kids make their decisions, and their time was, they can play adult football or adult soccer or whatever if they want. I think people trying to live their lives vicariously through their kids is not a good thing. They need to learn and make their own decisions and mistakes and positives.
No, I absolutely agree. Let me give you a bit of advice. I know you're no stranger to the Colony Centre. Don't say you can play the guitar. They'll have you doing a concert.
No, they won't.
This is what they do.
No, they won't. When I lived in Spain, I got away playing in Irish bars, playing kind of pop songs because with the anglicised voice. That was in the mid 1990s. No, I wouldn't. They'd have me once and they wouldn't have me back. So, and I don't do all that ballad stuff. It's grand, but it's not my thing. So
what sort of music do you like?
The music I like to listen to, so kind of Crowded House, Ron Sexsmith, singer-songwriters. This is the stuff I like to listen to. I like to try and play. I used to play with two colleagues from SIP2 for a while. We played a few times, and we went by the name Industrial Dispute, which was probably appropriate given that we were all working for the trade union movement, but we're no more. One of them had a child, and that's that. So,
one of the things that we discovered when we were trying to put together the Connolly Centre and the Connolly influence more than the building was that, and I'm sure you know this, but Connolly insisted that every meeting that was done in Liberty Hall or held in Liberty Hall either finished with a play or finished with music. And he understood that communication value, and also off the day there was large sections of workers who couldn't read or write, so that was a great way of communicating. And there seems always to be this relationship with the left and with folk music or political folk music or whatever. Do you have a particular preference in terms of any of that? Do you like, are you a Woody Guthrie fan? Are you into...
I wouldn't be a huge Woody Guthrie fan. I mean, like, trade union movement and culture and the arts is synonymous. The whole concept of bread and roses. Yeah. It's always been there. It's not just an Irish phenomenon. It's right across the world, and I think it's part of. It's in our DNA, and it's great. And with the two lads I was talking about, we've played many retirement do in SIP2 in the Connolly Room, actually, which is part. I mean, SIP2's head office has a wonderful theatre and a bar with some kind of performing arts areas, which is great, and they've had many great singer-songwriters there. So I think it's part of the wider trade union movement ethos. The one thing I'll say about Connolly, I mean, I think that, you know, and Bobby Balla's picture there, which is interesting. There was a really good play there recently, which we showed in situ, Connolly and Pearson, the dichotomy and the difference of interest in the whole 1916 thing. I feel it's a tragedy in Northern Ireland that Connolly is exclusively seen as, you know, yes, socialist, but, you know, he is seen in a tabloidized way as owned by the Republican movement. To me, you know, when I think of Connolly, I think of, yes, he was a Republican. He was a socialist, he was an internationalist, he was all those things. And the whole Connolly-Walker debate, which I think is interesting, and I think it should give people from a unionist background, make them feel more comfortable with their socialist trade union heritage as well. But I think we need to unravel the binary element of Connolly when it comes to Northern Ireland. And I think the centre can play a role in doing that. I think the trade union movement can play a role in doing that. But again, it's about people being willing to debate, open and hear and listen and engage. And I think that's really important. And I think the perception of Connolly in the Republic of Ireland is to some degree different from Northern Ireland because of the different lived experience to a large degree as well. But I think that's very important, that we challenge ourselves, and that Connolly's not owned by one community.
Oh,
he is, you know, and his learnings, his writings and his legacy should be seen as something that is, you know, yes, he was involved in 1916 in the ICA, but he was an internationalist, he was a socialist, and those things are, they're broader, and I think, you know, it's people like the Connolly Centre and yourselves and people like me have a responsibility to, I think, articulate that and kind of constantly make that point without, by the way, apologising for any of his legacy. And I think Connolly is one of those characters where you can kind of say, well, I think he was right here, I think he was wrong here, and I think that's the richness of history and debate and discussion and argument.
I absolutely agree with you, and the ethos of the Connolly Centre would be that you reach out.
Yeah.
That one of the things that we point out while we bring tours into the Connolly Centre is, and this sounds a wee bit kind of nearly morbid, that Connolly's death was part of his life, but the bigger part of his life and the legacy of his life is Connollyism and all of the stuff that was there. One of the things that struck us when we first opened the Connolly Centre a couple of years back was that even in this immediate vicinity, that most people knew, for instance, how Connolly died. When you scrape that away, lots of people didn't know, hadn't got a working understanding of his writings, of his teachings, of all of that. Now, if that's in an area where there is no hostility to Connolly, how much more difficult? And the obvious thing is this here, reaching out is what you do and how you move things forward. So I absolutely agree with you. Can I just, I wanted to, you talked about part of your regime, if that's the right word, of relaxing is to read. My mother, who was a trade unionist, was a member of the Tailor Workers Union from she was a young girl, talked about reading. If you can read, you're on a magic carpet. You can be anywhere. So what do you read? Do you have a wide variety? Or
Not really. I don't read much fiction. Never really did. It's all kind of political biographies and political stuff. Tony Judd, you know, historical stuff. It's very much within the framework of kind of what I do. But you know, it's just what I do to relax and unwind, and I enjoy. But I probably should read fiction a bit more. Every time I dip into it, I kind of say, why don't I do that a bit more? Then time, you know, it's like, you know, it's kind of you kind of read on your holidays. It's you know, it's creating the time and the space.
A young friend of mine, a chemist actually, and a chemist had a shop or worked in a chemist shop nearby. It's just embarked on a year-long trip to South America, and he had asked me to recommend a book. And I gave him The Ragged Trouser Philanthropist and told him not to read it until he was on his journey. And like most people, you tell things to do, he does the opposite. So he read it and came back, and his jaw was touching his knees, and had to kind of explain to him that this is a book for all times and all of that. So I think educate that you may be free, and reading is one of the great mediums of education. So I absolutely agree with you that education is. Do you enjoy the countryside? I went to ask you earlier on. Donegal's a beautiful place.
It's funny, like when I was 18, I couldn't wait to get out of Donegal. Went to UCD for 4 years, and as each decade goes by, I love it even more.
That's old age, by the way.
Yeah, I know, I'm aware of that. I mean, my dad lives in Greencastle overlooking the Foyle. You can see kind of McGilligan, Coleraine, and it's, you know, it's beautiful. We lived for a while in Dunfanaghy and Raphoe because he worked in the bank. We moved around, so I mean, West Donegal, Inishowen, it's beautiful. It's spectacular, and I really love it. And you know, as years go by, I even feel a closer affinity to it. My mother died there 2.5 years ago. She's buried in Ballybrack in Greencastle. Dad, he's 84, 85 now, so. Yeah, I have a real affinity with it, and me and my young fellow, we go, when pre-COVID we used to go to Donegal games. He lives in this world where he thinks, he's 14, that Donegal have been successful forever. I've been trying to tell him, you know, we've been to 3 All-Ireland finals, and the first one was 1992. You know, it's not always this way, but Donegal is where I feel I am from and of. My grandfather's people were all from Owe Island, Kincashla. So yeah, there's and you know, the older you get, these things mean more to you.
That's right.
Place, and because we did move around as kids a lot. I went to like 7 different schools. So because you know, every 3 years you were moving, so sense of place was kind of disrupted. So I think, like, I'm 48 now. That thing means more to me now, and Donegal as a county would be home ultimately, I suppose.
Oscar Wilde, as you know, and I'm sure you've read Wilde, talked about. Youth been wasted on young people, and I think sometimes, and from my own life experience, the older you get, the more pleasure you get in simple things,
yes.
and the things that you haven't seen 5 years before just spring out on you, and they're there. We talked about, and you talked about briefly about COVID and the effect that it had on people, and if you would believe the media, which I'm sure you don't, nor I. That we were all in it together, and everybody was shoulder to the wheels, and the health service, all of a sudden, something that we have known all our lives, the health service is wonderful. So all of a sudden the establishment media talks about the health service, and I'm not so sure they'll have the same benevolent view of them when they're asked to pay for a service. But there are examples of workers being badly treated and been abused and during the pandemic. Was the union the first port of call for many of those workers to defend their interests?
Probably for those who were organised.
That's what I mean.
For those who weren't organised, probably not, unfortunately. And that's the nub of the issue that's the nut we're going to have to crack to make trade unionism something that's universally accessible. And it's not, because of a range of things. Primarily the legislative framework in which we operate in here in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland.
Break that down for me.
Okay, so for example, if a group of workers come together and they want to be organised, in Northern Ireland there's legislation that allows you win recognition. But there has to be more than 20 workers in the firm. 90% of businesses in Northern Ireland have less than 20 workers. So that legislation is largely redundant. In the Republic of Ireland, we have no rights. It's nearly like Hungary, you know, we've no legal right to collective bargaining. Now there's a European Union directive which we are working on. I'm involved in the ETC, which is the European Trade Union Confederation, on fair wages and collective bargaining, and we're hoping that will be developed and transposed. But that would be a huge advancement in the Republic of Ireland. Workers have the right to be in a union, but the employer has a right not to recognise you.
That's amazing. I knew that.
Yeah.
Simply because of my own trade union background and being in the Colony Centre, been associated with the Colony Centre. But I think that when most people listen to what you've just said, that you don't have that right to be recognised. It's amazing.
Our density, the proportion of workers in a union on the island of Ireland is about 35%. So despite those legal boulders that are in our way, we still represent about 800,000 workers on the island, about 200,000 in Northern Ireland, 600,000 in the Republic. But I talk to colleagues in Europe and they'll say, oh, you know, we have the right to organise, we have the right to be heard, we have the right to collective bargaining, and we don't. And it's it's a legacy of centre-right governments in the Republic of Ireland, centre-right led governments. When we have made improvements, there have been constitutional challenges and the Supreme Court has struck them down. Hence the importance of Europe, because if we get this EU directive, European law takes primary relevance over Irish law. But just on the pandemic, I think, and I'm very optimistic, with every crisis, it's the old cliche, there's an opportunity. I think the pendulum has shifted right across the Western world to social democratic and socialist values. Because who would have thought that a Tory government would have introduced a furlough scheme that would have paid people up to 80% of their salary? And by the way, it shows how poor the social welfare scheme is.
Yeah.
It penalises and punishes, it doesn't protect. And I think the issue is the values that people hold are left of centre values. They're pro-collective. They're pro-trade union without them actually saying, I like trade unions. Those values
are decent.
Yes, so it's about us tapping into that politically and socially through trade union movement, through political expression as well. Because I think the future, it's something we can be optimistic about. And there's much that can and should be done. But we have to be strategic. We have to constantly look at ourselves and say, are we fit for purpose? Are we adequately reflective of the workforce that's out there? And we sometimes in the trade union movement have a habit of talking to ourselves. We need to talk beyond, and we need to listen, and we need to learn, and we need to evolve. And it's that constant thing, Joe, about every conversation we have, we should be saying, well, we can learn something here.
Yeah.
You know, values don't change, but the tools to implement the values need to change. And I mean, you know, our movement needs to be able to connect with people of my daughter's generation, whatever background they're from, because at the end of the day, they're all workers. You know, if they're third level educated, professional, whatever, they are still ultimately selling their labour. Old terminology, but that's what they're doing. You know, they're engaging in something and they're receiving something for it. And I do believe they will always be better if there is a collective authority, a collective interest that they can be part of, that can bargain for them, assist them, help shape the narrative. They'll always do better. So our future is there. We just have to make sure we own it and we make it. You know.
And of course, it's not without resistance. When you look at how some sections of the media have described the trade union movement, have rubbished the trade union movement, have talked about, you know, the trade union movement being a division rather than I mean, that's not a coincidence. That's the battle line's been drawn for a post-pandemic, I think, confrontation.
I think it was always that way, and it's not a coincidence for two reasons. One, you look at the ownership structure of a lot of the media, but secondly, when the media report on trade unions, it's about closures or strikes, largely, because they see that as newsworthy. They don't report. I mean, I spent 3 years after the economic crash negotiating change where it was about restructuring and concession bargaining. The media don't report stories where the trade union got together, negotiated a survival package to keep a company afloat, where it and its members made huge sacrifices in the interest of the greater good, the wider community. That's not sexy, it's not news, but you know, if there's a transport dispute and people are discommoded, it's news. And I was involved in a fair few transport disputes, and I'd always say in those kind of things, we will take our share of the blame, but there's two parties to this dispute, so there's a proportionate share. And I think it's really important that no matter who the media are, that if a mic is put under our face, we engage, no matter what it is, no matter how bad the story is, because if we don't, someone else will shape our story and our narrative. So, you know, I was involved in a very unpopular strike, the Lewis dispute, because of what the demands were perceived to be, and the Lewis drivers weren't popular the way, say, bus drivers would be. But we always took the opportunity, we must engage with the media, no matter how difficult it might be, because if we don't, other people will shape our narrative. And at the end of the day, we won through and kept our membership and didn't lose any members elsewhere. So I think if you don't engage with the media, all media, social media, etc., you're missing a trick here.
I actually, although I'm Belfast based, I followed that strike and I followed the nuances of it and the walkouts and the lockouts and the threats and huffing and blowing. And it's kind of struck me that, and maybe this is off key, but it struck me that not only were membership protected and jobs looked after. The community service was also protected, and what the community needed, I think, in terms of an effective, efficient service was also, so it had more, for me, looking at it outside, it had more to do simply by looking after jobs. It had to do with all the resources there.
It did, and in any transport dispute, particularly one that's owned by the state or semi-owned by the state, the workers have a lot of power, but it's important to use that power wisely, carefully, and not disproportionately, because well, for two reasons. One, like, you could have a shop where the workers have huge grievances, and you might say the inevitable consequences, you have to have a strike. Well, if they don't have leverage, if they don't have power, having a strike in an instance like that is lambs to the slaughter, and actually it's bad leadership. And at the same time, in public transport, you use the tool of a strike as the weapon of last resort, and the best ones are the ones that don't happen, that are resolved. But if they do happen, you have to know that the workers are prepared to be out for as long as it lasts, whatever that takes. I always used to say, when we'd be balloting for strike action, someone might say, how long do you think this might take? And I said, it could be days, could be weeks, could be months. And if you're not prepared for that, please vote no.
Yeah,
because when we open the ballot box, I would never say to people, vote yes, and sure, the employer will buckle and it'll be fine. Because you're misleading people, and you're abusing people, and you're abusing their trust in the union. I always used to say, and would say to people, unless you're 110% prepared for the worst of what this is involved, please vote no. And then when you open the box and you see an 80+%, you know these guys are fully behind us. So I think strikes are something that are strategic, they're important, you need to use them, but you don't use them willy-nilly, and it's about being very thorough and forensic about it. But when they happen, you have to ensure you win. And by the way, a win at the outset, or what is perceived to be a win at the outset, may look very different to a win 2 months later.
Well, I mean, I think there's examples even here in the north where you had workers' action around Harlan Wood, and you had workers' action around Redbus.
Yeah.
And
Hovis recently as well.
Of course, that's right. And all of those saved jobs, saved the economy, the local economy, because money generated through workers was been spent and all of that there. And for me, it kind of demonstrates a couple of things, and I'm sure you'll comment on this. It demonstrated when you have support and you sell the argument right, you get more support. But secondly, the skills of those who are involved in the negotiation. Yeah. And I know that the Irish Congress puts a large stock, a large faith into workers' education. So do you want to maybe talk a wee bit about that? And
about just on those disputes, can I say, I mean, Unite and GMB were the two unions involved in the Harlan and Wolff, and and Rightbus was pretty much Unite. And I think the Harlan and Wolff one was particularly interesting because, the history of Harlan and Wolff and how it is seen, and that one section of the community historically, there was a situation where the union had really good lay leadership, good leadership in the unions, developed a really good campaign, very attractive. And they bargained and they won. They mobilised political support across the political spectrum, and they stuck at it. And they had community support. They had support from all sectors of the community, and they brought people together. And it's an example of where the trade union movement on a specific issue can bring people together, irrespective of their identity. And I think there's a lot of learnings from that. Hovis was a wonderful dispute. The workers were being treated less fairly than their colleagues in Britain, an essential service. They stuck at it, they went out and they won a significant pay increase. And there's a lot of, I think what we need to do is, when we have a really good dispute, look at it and look at the lessons, what worked, what didn't work, and learn from that and educate ourselves as we go forward. Trade union education is fundamental. When I was in SIPTU, we had a SIPTU college, people like Francis Devine, who you know.
I know well.
Great guy, Francie.
Yeah. And a great singer.
And a great singer and a great poet. He follows Finn Harps, which is a bit, even though I'm a Donegal man,
he was doing okay until that.
Derry City would be my team, Katrina Shone and Derry, but a great tutor. And if you have tutors, we have an educational facility within the ICTU as well. People who go through those processes can be inspired by some of those tutors. And those tutors are people who've done the job of shop stewards, they've been on strike, they've learned and they have reflected on their experience. And I think trade union education is so core to what we're about, because, as I said, whether it's a conversation, whether it's a conversation even with an employer who you have a difference of opinion with, you take something away from it, you learn from it, you assimilate it and try and use it to what you're trying to achieve. So whether it's trade union education in the classroom, whether it's engaging with people that we don't necessarily agree with, whatever it is, we're constantly learning. The day we feel we know it all and we have all the answers is the day we fail. I am 48 and I'm still learning, and I'm hoping doing this job, and I'm 65 and still learning. It's key to everything, keeping an open mind.
And can I ask you, we're almost finished, you'll be glad to hear, but can I ask you, post-pandemic, and what I think is the kind of reorganization of capitalism around the pandemic, the lessons that were learned, the effect on the economy, all of that. And of course, let's tighten our belt to get over the bad period, which normally means that workers either don't get the raise they're entitled to, or in fact lose money. And I suspect that the first, well, perhaps not the first, but within the first wave of that will be the health service. Are you concerned in terms of what we're heading into, or are you confident? Or
I'm concerned, but I'm confident if we go about it the right way. We published a paper last year called No Going Back Towards a Safe and Secure Future for All. It was an all-island Congress paper looking at the two jurisdictions and the conditions that apply in both. And basically what we're saying in that paper, it's a kind of a manifesto for the future, that we're going to hear, we now need to pay for the furlough scheme. We need to pay for all of the benefits we gave business and workers. What we found out was that employers in Northern Ireland pay 41% when it comes to national insurance on labour compared to employers in Europe, other wealthy countries. Employers in the Republic of Ireland pay 48%. Now, if employers in Northern Ireland paid their fair share, and by the way, we're not suggesting that now, as they're just getting up off their knees, we hit them with an increase in tax, but it should be over the next 5 to 10 years. But if they pay their fair share, that's an extra $3.5 billion to the Northern Ireland executive to spend. In the Republic of Ireland, it's an extra $9 billion. That's significant, and we could do a lot with that. So we don't need to have pay cuts and tightening our belt for all when it comes to economic regeneration. A couple of things we can do as well. We've assembly elections coming up, maybe this year, but definitely next year. Employment rights is a devolved matter in Northern Ireland. We've done nothing with it. We need a progressive reforming minister in the Department for the Economy who will use employment rights. Employment rights aren't something that we do when things are good. You use it to be a spur for economic generation and productivity. And we could make collective bargaining, which is what unions do. We could make legislation that promotes it, sector bargaining, that means unions and employers can sit down on sectors, take wages out of competition, and bargain on other things, so that employers don't use the cost of labour as a kind of as an issue to compete with one another on. They compete on quality of service. They compete on performance and things like that. So there's a lot we could do. In the Republic of Ireland, we could transpose that EU directive so that workers fundamentally, after 100 years of the state, have the right to organise. If we can do those things, we have a real opportunity to bargain for fairness and justice in society. If we don't try and make those tools available to ourselves and fight with one hand tied behind our back and stand on the sidelines and just kind of call things out, well, the future will pass us by. And I think what we need to do is mobilise, campaign, agitate. We need to make the 5 political parties in the executive listen to the needs of their constituents, who are workers, some of them are trade union members, and come together. NDNA have a really good clause on workers' rights. I couldn't have written it better myself. If that could be legislated for, 500,000 workers in Northern Ireland would have the right to collective bargaining that they don't have. And it would improve our productivity and our economy. We always hear Northern Ireland performs badly, bad productivity. In the Republic of Ireland, if we transpose that EU directive that's coming, we could do a lot. So it's not a win-lose. It's actually to raise everybody's boats. And our job is to educate employers and others who don't necessarily agree with us that actually it is in society's interest. It's not in a sectional interest that, workers, employers, zero sum. It's in society's interest that we do this. That's a long struggle. We've a way to go, but we have to do it. But we have to get our hands dirty. There's no point in being pure, politically clean on the sidelines, on the margins, where many of our opponents would like us to be, and like us to put us. But sometimes some of our own want to be politically pure as well. And we need to just get our hands dirty and make sure that this generation of workers have better conditions of employment that their parents have. That is the natural evolution. It cannot go backwards, it has to go forwards. And I think we can do it with the right tools.
We're in the Connolly Centre, and as I said when I began, you're no stranger to the Connolly Centre, and quite often what we do here is reflect on the 100 years or reflect on Connolly's death or his writings or whatever. 100 years' time, will we have a trade union Congress?
We will. We have to. I mean, I think we are very good at celebrating heroic defeats, Pyrrhic victories in many ways, but we do learn from them. They do inspire us to the future. I think what we need to be doing in 100 years' time, we reflect back, is celebrating the heroic victories. And there needs to be many, many more of them. And I think with the right tools, with the right people, with the right organisation, with the right political focus, we can do that. And we need to be all embracing. And here in particular, in Northern Ireland, we need to be that centre ground that says, irrespective of your nationality, irrespective of the political tradition you come from, your trade union is your home. And it will reflect who you are, and that your identity is diverse and plural. And whether you're Irish, Northern Irish, British, all of that, none of that, international, the trade union is your home, and it needs to be a welcoming home. And we need to constantly modify and modernise and make sure we do that. And I think if we do that, we will have a wonderful future, Joe.
Owen Reidy, and those famous words, hopefully accurate words, thank you. You've been a great guest and a great conversation.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you. Shin Shin.